10 a.m., March 3rd, 1943. Over the flat tropical waters of the Bismarck Sea, the future of Pacific warfare is about to be decided. Below, a Japanese convoy of 16 ships steams steadily towards Lae, New Guinea, a critical island in the unforgiving slog of the Pacific campaign. 6 months after the Americans turned the tide at Midway, and just weeks after the bloody Allied triumph on Guadalcanal, wrapped up in February, the war's focus has sharpened onto this one colossal island. For both sides, New Guinea is a critical stepping stone. For the Japanese, it's the last barrier protecting their main fortress at Rabaul and a launchpad to threaten Australia. For the Allies, under General Douglas MacArthur, taking New Guinea is the essential next step on the long road to Tokyo. Before 1943, the relationship between bombers and ships was mostly one of missed opportunities. The prevailing wisdom in the US Army Air Forces was that bombers attack from way up high. It made sense on paper. Height gave you safety from anti-aircraft fire and allowed complex tools, like the prized Norden bomb sight, the time and stability to calculate the perfect drop. The image was one of scientific precision. A bomber serenely flying in the stratosphere. A bombardier releasing a single bomb that would fall for miles to strike a ship with pinpoint accuracy. The reality? It was a mess. Trying to hit a moving ship from 20,000 feet was less like science and more like trying to drop a pebble into a bucket from a skyscraper during a windstorm. The bomber's speed and altitude were constantly shifting. The bomb was at the mercy of changing winds, and the target below was a ship captain spinning his wheel for all he was worth. The math was a nightmare, and the results were abysmal. General Kenny's 5th Air Force had been flying missions for months, and the stats were damning. Hundreds of flights would result in just a handful of hits, and even those often weren't fatal. A bomb might punch a hole in a deck, but it wouldn't sink the ship. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the icon of American air power, was a magnificent plane, but it was a terrible ship killer when used this way. The B-25 Mitchell, a smaller twin-engine bomber, was nimble, but it was no better suited for the job. It was designed to bomb static targets like rail yards, not play tag with destroyers. And when it did fly low, its machine guns were for self-defense, not for a brawl. This rigid thinking created a huge vulnerability for the Allies. Japan was an island empire that lived and died by its maritime supply lines. Its navy and merchant marine were the arteries feeding its war machine. Cutting those arteries was the key to winning the war, yet the main tool for the job, the bomber, was proving to be hopelessly ineffective. Every Japanese convoy that got through to places like Lae strengthened the enemy, prolonged the war, and cost Allied lives on the ground. The aircrews were frustrated. They were risking their lives only to watch their bombs splash harmlessly into the ocean. General Kenny knew something had to change, and fast. He couldn't afford to keep trading hundreds of missions for 1 or 2 damaged ships. He needed to turn his bombers from shaky high-altitude snipers into low-level shotguns that couldn't miss. The doctrine was failing. The stage was set for an innovator who saw the problem not from a general's map, but from the cockpit. The man with the answer was about as far from a by-the-book officer as you could get. Paul "Pappy" Gunn was born in rural Arkansas in 1899 and was obsessed with airplanes from a young age. He was a Navy vet who had learned his trade from the ground up, with grease under his fingernails and an intuitive feel for machines. After retiring from the Navy in 1939, he helped start Philippine Airlines. When war broke out, he was a civilian pilot, but immediately volunteered, flying harrowing evacuation missions in unarmed planes and earning a Distinguished Flying Cross for his bravery. Gunn was older than most of the pilots, which earned him the nickname Pappy. But his age hid a restless, innovative spirit. He was a master of daredevil low-level flying and a genius at mechanical improvisation. When he was commissioned into the Army Air Forces and got to Australia in 1942, he didn't just see airplanes. He saw problems that needed fixing. His first project was the A-20 Havoc, a light bomber. Pappy started tinkering, ripping out equipment and cramming in extra machine guns scavenged from wrecked fighters. He packed 4.50 caliber machine guns into the nose, turning a light bomber into a deadly low-level strafing machine. When General Kenny arrived to take command, he found Gunn in the middle of these unauthorized modifications. Where another commander might have seen a court-martial, Kenny saw a solution. He was so impressed that he brought Pappy onto his personal staff as a special projects officer. This was the crucial moment. Kenny gave Gunn the freedom to innovate. Pappy's modified A-20s were a hit, so Kenny gave him a more ambitious project, the B-25 Mitchell. The B-25 was a bigger, sturdier plane, and in it, Gunn saw the potential for a true commerce destroyer. His approach was brutally direct. He took a standard B-25 and essentially tore out its original purpose. The glass bombardier's nose was removed. In its place, Gunn and his team started packing machine guns, first 4, then 6, then 8.50 cals, all fixed to fire forward, controlled by the pilot. But that wasn't enough. He designed external cheek pods for the sides of the fuselage, each holding 2 more guns. Some planes even had their top turrets fixed to fire forward. The result was a monster of firepower. A single B-25 could now bring the forward-facing firepower of 3 P-51 Mustang fighters to bear on a single target. With up to 14 machine guns blazing, it could unleash a torrent of lead that would obliterate anything in its path. This was a radical idea. Bombers were supposed to fly high and avoid fights. Pappy Gunn had turned the B-25 into a brawler, a flying gunship designed for terrifying close-quarters combat. He was a blacksmith's son who had forged a new weapon, not in a factory, but in a dusty hangar on the other side of the world, using scavenged parts and sheer ingenuity. The first squadron was equipped just in time for a major test, a battle that would prove whether Pappy's creation was a curiosity or the future of aerial warfare. Pappy Gunn's flying arsenal solved one half of the problem: how to get close to a heavily armed ship and survive. A B-25 strafer could now suppress a ship's anti-aircraft gunners with an overwhelming storm of fire. But that still left the other, more important half of the problem. How do you actually sink the ship? A ship full of bullet holes is one thing, but a ship with a gaping hole below the waterline is a dead ship. The answer was a technique as brutally simple as it was terrifyingly dangerous: skip bombing. The idea itself wasn't entirely new. The British, Italians, and Soviets had all experimented with the concept of bouncing a bomb across water like a skipping stone. But it was in the Southwest Pacific where the tactic was truly perfected and weaponized. General Kenny and his aide, Major Bill Benn, were early champions of the idea. By September 1942, months before the big battle, the 63rd Bomb Squadron was already practicing against a wrecked ship in Port Moresby Harbor. They figured out the basic principles: fly at the target at high speed and extremely low altitude, sometimes just 10 to 15 feet off the water, and release the bomb about 300 yards out. The secret ingredient was a bomb with a 4 to 5 second delay fuse. The execution was controlled chaos. A pilot would fly his bomber straight at the enemy ship, hurtling towards it just feet above the waves, right into the teeth of its defensive fire. At the perfect moment, the bomb was released. Instead of plunging into the sea, its momentum caused it to skip off the surface 1 or 2 times, hardly losing any speed. Because it never rose more than about 16 feet, it was almost guaranteed to strike the side of the ship. The delayed fuse then did its work. The bomb would hit the hull, and in the 4 seconds before it detonated, it could either punch through the thin armor or sink just below the surface. When it blew, the force was amplified by the water, creating a catastrophic hydraulic hammer effect that would break the ship's back or tear open its hull. This was the death blow. It was often combined with mast-height bombing, where a plane would fly directly at the ship's mast and drop its bombs at the last second. Together with Pappy Gunn's strafers, these tactics created the ultimate trifecta. The attack was breathtakingly audacious. First, the strafing run. The B-25 opens up with its terrifying machine guns, sweeping the decks, silencing the gunners, and sowing panic. With the defenses suppressed, the bomber keeps coming. Then, the skip bomb release. As the bombs bounce toward their target, the B-25 yanks up hard, clearing the ship's masts by mere feet before banking away. The whole thing, from strafing to bomb impact, could last less than a minute. It was a brutal, intimate, and incredibly effective form of combat. The B-25 gunship was tailor-made for it. The Maverick mechanic's innovation had found its perfect partner in a radical new tactic. Now, all they needed was a target. While the Allies were forging their new weapons, the Japanese were making a fateful decision. At their sprawling base in Rabaul, Operation 81 was coming together. This was no routine supply run. It was a major effort to reinforce their precarious position in New Guinea. After an Australian victory at Wau, Japanese commanders were deeply worried about defending the vital hub of Lae. In a desperate bid to regain the initiative, they decided to send the bulk of the 51st Division directly to Lae by sea. The convoy that assembled in Rabaul at the end of February 1943 was a testament to that desperation. It consisted of 8 transport vessels, packed with roughly 6,900 soldiers, heavy equipment, ammo, and fuel. To protect this precious cargo, the Imperial Japanese Navy assigned a powerful escort, 8 of their finest destroyers. And to top it off, a combat air patrol of around 100 fighters would provide an air shield. Japanese planners knew the danger. They knew the route was well within range of Allied air power and that an attack was likely. They'd even run a smaller convoy in January and lost ships. Still, they felt they had no choice. The alternative, a long, grueling march through jungle and mountains, was deemed even worse. They hoped a new route, hugging the northern coast of New Britain, might offer better cover from storms and maybe, just maybe, throw the Allies off their scent. It was a calculated risk, but the Japanese had a fatal blind spot. They had no idea that their greatest protection, the element of surprise, was already gone. In Brisbane and Washington, D.C., Allied codebreakers working on the MAGIC program had been reading the Japanese Navy's encrypted messages. They knew about Operation 81. They knew what was in it, where it was going, and when it was leaving. General Kenny's 5th Air Force wouldn't be stumbling upon this convoy by chance. They would be waiting for it. The Japanese thought they were embarking on a risky but viable military operation. In reality, they were sailing directly into a perfectly planned ambush. The 8 transports and 8 destroyers of Operation 81 were not just a convoy, they were bait, and the trap was about to spring. On February 28, 1943, Operation 81 slipped out of Rabaul and into the Bismarck Sea. For the first day, the weather cooperated, providing a cloak of low clouds that hid the 16 ships. But on the afternoon of March 1st, a patrolling B-24 Liberator, blown off course by a storm, stumbled upon the fleet. The game was on. The first Allied attacks on March 2nd were probing and conventional. High-altitude B-17s went in, facing fierce resistance from Japanese fighters and bad weather. They managed to score some hits and sink one transport, the Kyokusei Maru, but for the most part, these attacks just proved how ineffective the old tactics were. It was only the prelude. The morning of March 3rd dawned with better weather. The convoy was now in the Huon Gulf, steaming toward Lae. At 10 a.m., the sky erupted. The Allied attack was a masterclass in coordination. First came the Bristol Beaufighters of the Royal Australian Air Force. Flying at treetop level, these heavily armed fighters swept in, their cannons and machine guns targeting the bridges and anti-aircraft guns of the Japanese destroyers. Their goal, to decapitate the escort's leadership and suppress the defensive fire. Moments later, the main act began. 13 of Pappy Gunn's modified B-25s screamed in at mast height. The Japanese sailors, already reeling, now faced a new kind of hell. A solid wall of lead tore across their decks, chewing through steel and structures. As the B-25s roared over the ships, they let loose their bombs, which skipped across the waves and slammed into the hulls of the transports and destroyers. At the same time, B-17S bombed from higher altitudes to divide the Japanese defenses, while unmodified B-25s also attacked from medium altitude. It was a multi-pronged assault designed for maximum chaos. But the heart of the battle happened at sea level. The melee was swift and brutal. Within the first 15 minutes of the low-level attack, the fate of the convoy was sealed. The transport Teomaru was hit and sank. The destroyers Arashio and Tokitsukaze were crippled, left dead in the water. All 7 remaining transports were hit, set ablaze, or sinking. The scene was one of great intensity and destruction. The sky was a swirling dogfight between Allied P-38 Lightnings and Japanese Zeros. The sea was littered with burning ships, oil slicks, and thousands of struggling soldiers. During the battle, one B-17 was hit, and as its crew bailed out, they were subjected to enemy fire by Japanese fighters while in their parachutes. Enraged P-38 pilots saw this, dove on the Zeros, and shot down 5 of them in revenge. By 10:22 a.m., the main battle was over. The convoy wasn't just defeated, it was destroyed. That afternoon, Allied aircraft returned to finish the job, relentlessly attacking the crippled hulks. In the days that followed, American PT boats and planes hunted down the remaining cripples and, according to some controversial accounts, opened fire on survivors in the water and on rafts to prevent them from reaching Lae. Of the 6,900 troops sent to reinforce New Guinea, only about 1,200 ever made it ashore. Another 2,700 were rescued and returned to Rabaul. The rest, around 2,890 soldiers and sailors, were killed. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea is a dramatic example of how a single innovation can change the course of a war. If you find these hidden stories of military history fascinating, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next deep dive into the events that shaped our world. The final tally of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was staggering and heavily one-sided. All 8 Japanese transport ships were at the bottom of the ocean. 4 of the 8 escorting destroyers were also sunk. In exchange, the Allies lost only 4 aircraft in combat. For Japan, it was, as one of their destroyer captains later described it, an unbelievable debacle. The strategic consequences were immediate and profound. The battle effectively ended any major Japanese attempt to reinforce New Guinea by sea. The aerial blockade that Kenny's forces had now proven they could enforce was total. From that point on, the Japanese had to rely on submarines and barges to supply their troops, a trickle that could never sustain a major war effort. The garrisons at Lae and Salamaua were left to wither on the vine, just as Kenny had predicted. Within a month, the Japanese airfields at Lae were useless, and by September, the base itself fell. The battle had irrevocably shifted the balance of power in New Guinea, paving the way for MacArthur's island-hopping campaign to push north. That 15-minute storm of fire in the Bismarck Sea was more than just a successful battle. It was a revolution, a brutal declaration that the age of the battleship's supremacy was over. The future belonged to air power. General Billy Mitchell's controversial pre-war theories that land-based bombers could single-handedly destroy naval fleets were proven correct in the most dramatic way possible. This was a lopsided naval defeat, inflicted without a single Allied warship taking part in the main fight. The twin innovations, Papillon's B-25 gunship and the skip bombing technique, were a paradigm shift. They showed that American ingenuity, born from battlefield necessity, could create a weapon system that made traditional convoy tactics obsolete. News of the victory echoed all the way back to Washington. When General Kenny told factory engineers it was possible to create a B-25 strafer, they initially said it couldn't be done, only for him to inform them that it had already been done and had just won a major battle. Papillon's field modifications were soon incorporated into factory models, leading to B-25 variants armed with a massive 75mm cannon in the nose. These commerce destroyers would wreak havoc on Japanese shipping for the rest of the war. The battle was a turning point, proving that in modern warfare, control of the sea now began with control of the air. A maverick mechanic from Arkansas, a brilliant commander who nurtured innovation, and the brave aircrews who flew straight into the guns proved that you could change a war in the time it takes to skip a stone across water. It is 10:45 a.m. on March 18, 1943, high above the city of Frankfurt. For Luftwaffe ace Johannes Steinhoff, a veteran of the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front, 1943 was the year of the master. He and his fellow experten, expert aces with dozens, sometimes hundreds of kills, were the undisputed lords of the sky deep inside the Reich. They knew the Allied fighter escorts had short legs. The legendary British Spitfires could barely cross the English Channel and get back. The big American P-47 Thunderbolts had more range, but even they had to turn for home long before the B-17 and B-24 bombers reached their most vital targets. The German pilots had a deadly system. They would let the escorts burn their fuel, wait for those little friends to peel away, and then the real hunt would begin. The bomber formations, naked and vulnerable, were all theirs. Their homeland was their fortress. Then came 1944. That fortress was smashed wide open. The hunters weren't just at the gates anymore. They were in the house, waiting from the moment a German pilot took off. For men like Adolf Galland, Germany's revered general of fighters, the sight of a new silver predator over Berlin was a psychological breaking point. This is the story of how one American fighter completely erased the map of the air war. It's the story of how the P-51 Mustang's incredible range didn't just break the back of the Luftwaffe, it broke its most accomplished pilots by taking away their last sanctuary. In World War II, some weapons became legends. The German Tiger tank, the British Spitfire, the Soviet T-34. But legends can be tricky. They're often born from one overwhelming advantage. For one American fighter, that advantage wasn't its speed or its weapons power, though it had plenty of both. Its greatest weapon was something you couldn't measure in horsepower or caliber. It was range. This is the story of how the P-51 Mustang achieved something no other fighter of the war really could. It didn't just win air engagements, it systematically broke the will of the entire German Air Force. It did this by taking away the one thing every soldier needs to survive: a safe place to go home to. This is the story of why the once unbeatable masters of the German sky came to dread the Mustang's horrifying, seemingly endless reach. To get why the P-51 was so terrifying, you have to understand the grim reality of the air war in 1943. The American 8th Air Force, flying out of England, had a huge job: destroy Germany's war industry with high-altitude daylight aerial operations. The theory was that tightly packed formations of B-17 flying fortresses, with their dozens of .50 caliber machine guns, could defend themselves. They'd create a combat box, a bristling porcupine of lead that no enemy fighter could get through. It was a brave theory, but a tragically flawed one. The Luftwaffe pilots, flying their excellent Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, were veterans and masters of their craft. They figured out how to hit the bomber formations head-on, a terrifying pass where closing speeds hit 600 miles per hour. This exploited a blind spot in the bombers' forward guns and gave the gunners just seconds to react. They attacked in waves, focusing all their force on one bomber until it fell out of formation, where it could be swarmed and dealt with. The results were catastrophic for the Allies. A bomber crew's tour of duty was 25 missions. In 1943, the cold, hard math showed that a crewman's chance of actually finishing that tour was a horrifying 25%. The rest were lost, captured, or wounded. The skies over the Reich were a difficult proving ground. This bloody chapter peaked in the summer and fall of 1943. A mission in August against Schweinfurt and Regensburg saw 60 B-17 forced down out of 376. That's 600 men lost or captured in a single afternoon. But the absolute lowest point came on October 14th, 1943, a day forever known as Black Thursday. The target, again, was the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, a target so vital it was deemed worth any price. Of the 291 B-17 sent, 60 were lost over Germany. Another 17 were so damaged they were scrapped after landing. In total, 77 bombers were gone. More than 600 men didn't come home. The loss rate was a staggering 26%. The 8th Air Force was being severely tested. The losses were completely unsustainable. The American commanders had to face a terrible truth. The unescorted daylight bombing campaign was failing. The Luftwaffe was winning. German pilots could wait, save their fuel, and pounce once the short-legged P-47s and Spitfires hit bingo fuel and turned for home. The heart of Germany was a fortress, and its walls were the limited range of Allied fighters. The Luftwaffe pilots knew it. They had the home field advantage. They could engage, disengage, land, refuel, and climb back up to continue the air operations, all while deep inside friendly territory. Their morale was high. They were defending their homes, and they were damn good at it. The rules of the game were written in their favor. But those rules were about to be completely rewritten by an unlikely hero, an aircraft that would not just challenge the Luftwaffe, but haunt it. The story of the P-51 Mustang is one of a happy accident and a stroke of pure genius. It wasn't some grand, long-term project. In 1940, with the Battle of Britain raging, the British came to North American aviation, not to design a new plane, but to build the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. The P-40 was tough, but it was already falling behind the latest German fighters. North American's lead designer, a guy named Dutch Kindleberger, made a bold counteroffer. Instead of building someone else's old design, he promised he could create a much better fighter from scratch and do it in just 120 days. The British, desperate, said yes. In an incredible feat, the prototype, the NA-73X, was rolled out in 102 days. These early Mustangs, with their American-made Allison engines, were a mixed bag. They were fast and handled beautifully down low. The secret was a revolutionary laminar flow wing, which was designed to keep the air flowing smoothly over it, drastically reducing drag. It meant the plane could fly faster and farther on the same amount of fuel. But there was a big problem. The Allison engine was great at low altitudes, but it choked in the thin air up high, precisely where the bombers flew. It lacked a good high-altitude supercharger, which is basically a compressor that forces air into the engine so it can breathe. The plane could have ended up as just another decent ground attack fighter. But then, an RAF test pilot named Ronnie Harker had a brilliant idea. He suggested taking this amazing airframe and marrying it to the one engine that had mastered high altitude, the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin. It was a match made in heaven. In an amazing bit of transatlantic teamwork, Rolls-Royce fitted a Mustang with their new Merlin 60 series engine. This thing wasn't just powerful, it had a revolutionary two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Think of it as an automatic transmission for altitude. It allowed the engine to maintain its sea-level power way up in the stratosphere. The result was breathtaking. The new P-51B was a world beater. The marriage of the slick American airframe and the powerful British engine created what was arguably the best piston engine fighter of the war. Packard Motors started building the Merlin in the US, and soon the definitive P-51D, with its iconic bubble canopy, was rolling off the line. But performance was only half the story. The other half was range. The Mustang's design already gave it great gas mileage, but the real game changer was its fuel capacity. An 85-gallon tank was added behind the pilot's seat. When you combined that with two external drop tanks under the wings, the Mustang became a true long-distance marathon runner. A P-51D could now fly from England, escort bombers all the way to Berlin, participate in aerial combat for up to 30 minutes, and fly all the way back. While combat time was often less, the capability was there. The map of the air war had been redrawn. The invisible wall that protected Germany was about to be eliminated. While a Spitfire's range was a small circle around London, and a P-47's was a bigger one covering Western Germany, the P-51's range was a vast umbrella that put nearly the entire Third Reich within reach. For the first time, there was nowhere left for the Luftwaffe to hide. The first Merlin-powered Mustangs over Germany in late 1943 were a quiet tremor before the earthquake. At first, German pilots just noted enemy fighters further east than usual. The head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, initially dismissed the reports. Then, on March 4, 1944, the impossible happened. Air raid sirens screamed over Berlin. Citizens looked up and saw B-17s, But with them, high above, were single-engine fighters. And they weren't the twin-boomed P-38s that had made the trip before in small numbers. They were sleek, silver, and deadly. They were Mustangs. Over Berlin. The psychological shock to the Luftwaffe command was immense. A famous story, which is probably not true but perfectly captures the moment, claims Göring looked up, saw the Mustangs, and said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." Whether he said it or not, it was the truth. It was an admission that the entire air war was lost. The fortress was breached. The sanctuary was gone. To understand the terror this caused, let's put ourselves in the cockpit of a German pilot. We'll call him Hans. Before the Mustang, Hans's life was dangerous, but it had a rhythm. He'd scramble, climb to meet the bombers, and engage with the P-47 escorts. But he knew the Thunderbolts were thirsty. He knew that at a certain invisible line in the sky, they'd have to leave. Then, the real work, the harvest, could begin. The airspace deep inside Germany was his office. Now, everything was different. The hunt starts the second Hans's wheels leave the ground. As he climbs, his head is on a swivel, scanning the sky for that silver glint. The Mustang pilots, now freed from having to hug the bombers by a new directive from their commander, General Jimmy Doolittle, were actively hunting the Luftwaffe. There's no safe space to form up. There's no leisurely climb. From takeoff to landing, Hans is the one being hunted. The Mustangs are ghosts. They dive out of the sun, their 6.50 caliber machine guns discharging. The air engagement isn't a structured battle over the bombers anymore. It's a desperate brawl that can happen anywhere, at any time. And even if Hans survives and makes it back to his airfield, exhausted and low on fuel, the danger isn't over. The landing approach, once a moment of relief, is now the moment of greatest vulnerability. Because the Mustangs are waiting there too. American pilots began targeting German airfields, a brutally effective tactic. They'd come in at treetop level, flying over 400 miles per hour, and tear across the field, causing great damage to parked planes, fuel trucks, and anyone caught on the ground. For Hans, trying to land his Bf-109, there is no greater terror. He's slow, he's committed, he's a sitting duck. The airfield, once his sanctuary, is now just another part of the front line. This constant grinding pressure created a crisis in the Luftwaffe. Veteran aces, the Experten, were being worn down and lost. Men like Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, saw the disaster unfolding. The Americans could afford to trade plane for plane, pilot for pilot. Germany couldn't. As these veterans were lost, the training program was slashed. In the early war, a German pilot got over 200 hours of flight time. By 1944, they were being rushed to the front with as little as 160 hours, sometimes less. Their American adversary often had over 400 hours before even seeing combat. Imagine being that 18-year-old German kid. You barely know how to fly. You're thrown into a swirling chaos against an enemy who has a better plane and 4 times your experience. It was a high-risk scenario. The new pilots were lost in droves, forcing the schools to send even less prepared replacements, who were lost even faster. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing a war, it was being systematically disorganized. Morale hit rock bottom. A grim joke made the rounds in the mess halls. If you see a silver fighter, it's American. If you see a camouflaged fighter, it's British. If you see an invisible fighter, it's one of ours. It was a joke born from despair. The P-51 Mustang had become the ghost in the sky, a constant reminder that there was no escape, no sanctuary, and no hope. The story of the Luftwaffe's collapse isn't just about fear, it's written in cold, hard numbers. The statistics from 1944 paint a devastating picture, and the arrival of the long-range P-51 is the clear turning point. First, the bombers. Before the Mustang, bomber loss rates over 10% were common. By mid-1944, with Mustangs clearing the way, the average loss rate for heavy bombers dropped to just 1.7%. The P-51, along with other factors like improved tactics, absolutely enabled the strategic aerial operation to continue. Now look at the cost to the Luftwaffe. General Doolittle's strategy to go after the fighters turned the air war into a brutal war of attrition. In the first 5 months of 1944, the German fighter force on the Western Front simply ceased to exist as an effective force. They lost 143 fighters in January. In February, 524. March, 583. April, 687. And in May, a staggering 758. That's over 2,400 fighters put out of action in 5 months. By May, the Luftwaffe was losing over half of its entire frontline fighter strength every single month. But the most critical loss wasn't the machines, it was the men. From January to May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 2,262 fighter pilots, lost or wounded. At the start of the year, their entire single-engine fighter pilot force was only 2,395 men. They lost nearly an entire air force's worth of pilots in 5 months. The training schools couldn't keep up. In April alone, the front lost 489 pilots, while the schools could only supply 396 replacements. They were running a fatal deficit. The final brutal story is told in the exchange ratios. By late 1944, American fighter pilots were claiming more than 6 aerial victories for every one of their own fighters lost in air-to-air combat. The sky over Germany had become a challenge for the Luftwaffe. The P-51 Mustang was the primary weapon of this destruction. USAAF Mustang pilots claimed 4,950 enemy aircraft neutralized, more than any other Allied fighter. And those numbers don't even count the hundreds of planes disabled on the ground, the trains struck, or the German pilots who simply refused to take off. The verdict of the numbers is undeniable. The P-51 Mustang, because of its range, broke the Luftwaffe. It bled its veterans dry, threw its rookies into an unwinnable fight, and shattered its morale by turning every airfield into a critical zone. The Mustang's greatest weapon wasn't its guns, but its ability to be there, hundreds of miles from home, to use them. The legacy of the P-51 Mustang is etched in the sky over Europe. It was the right plane at the right time, a technological key that unlocked the German fortress, acted as the bomber crew's guardian angel, and became the Luftwaffe's grim adversary. But its deepest impact was psychological. It changed the entire mindset of the German fighter pilot, turning him from a confident hunter into a hunted man with no safe harbor. It was a fear born of range. The Mustang didn't just win air superiority, it won a war of attrition and morale, proving that industrial might could project power right into the enemy's heartland, erasing sanctuaries and breaking the will to fight. It's a testament to the idea that sometimes the most powerful weapon of all is simply the ability to be there. If you enjoyed this look into aviation history, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Now we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments. What other weapon do you think had the biggest psychological impact in World War II? Was it the terrifying scream of the Stuka dive aircraft, the silent threat of the U-boat, or something else? We're looking forward to reading your thoughts.